so this article was Social Distance and Parochial Altruism, an experimental study. And so, kind of the overall background is it was looking at how social distancing might affect parochial altruism, and then kind of also the larger scheme of how this plays into intergroup conflict and intergroup divide. So, especially within a region, and I'll get to that at the end, it's shown that that can actually play a pretty significant factor in kind of the identity of your in-group identity, and how you view the out-group and things like that. So to answer that for the methods, they did a study. They took 294 participants, and then they did a minimal group paradigm, or an MGP, and they put the participants into two groups. So using an IPDMD, an intergroup prisoner's dilemma, maximizing difference scenario. So basically, they gave each of the groups currency. The baseline group was only given the overall concept of what they were supposed to be doing. So they all got the currency. They were supposed to decide where to allocate it, whether it was between the groups, whether it was just their in-group, or they could keep it for themselves. And then they collected that data at the end. The test group, though, was given information about demographics. So they had basic things like gender, age, and then distance was one of the things that they were aware of, as well as, of course, just the general in-group and out-group as a whole. So they got to kind of see where they were located in the scheme of everyone else. What they found was that both groups ended up keeping most of it for themselves. And the second highest amount was in group, and the third was between groups, which would pretty much make sense naturally. But social distance was shown to play a factor. So
real fast, Natalie, just to be clear, social distance is being used in this case, not in sort of the lay term of like, how far away we are from each other physically. This is like actually like how far we perceive to be socially, in terms of identity. Is that right?
So it actually is based on physically distance. So that was the information they were given, but it plays into all of that. So kind of what happened and what we saw in the results was that the people who were given the information about where they sat, it impacted how close or far they felt from their own group or the out group. So for instance, one of the things that they talked about was the vulnerability factor. So people who were far from their in group and close to the out group may, for instance, feel vulnerable that their identity, their in group is not as strong, and that they could face retaliation for not giving things to the out group. And the in group and out group, if you were far from both of them, it was actually shown to have ironically a stronger sense with your in-group. So more people gave to their in-group than not, which they said was potentially because you're not only far from the out-group, so you're not really having interactions with them, but you're far from your in-group, so you feel that giving to your in-group may give you a closeness to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wait, so real fast, how did they set it up? So they brought all these people into a space, and then they just told them where to sit, and they actually distanced certain people far away? Or...
No, so I think it was actually done online, if I understood correctly, that it was an electronic thing. But basically, they showed a map. Actually, I'll see if I can bring that up on the. I think they showed an example of how they actually showed them. Yes, so they gave them a province boundary, and that was modified, and then they would put like the legend would show who was an out group, who was an in group, and where that fell in context with where that person was.
In a large regional space, like a city, or like in just a one room space or something.
Yeah, so it looks kind of. So actually, I'll see if I can share that. Well, I guess if Noah's sharing. So they did say that they preserved anonymity with it in the process. So I don't think it was necessarily, super detailed, but it was based on their actual information. So yeah.
I'm just wondering if it's like
Oh, go ahead.
Wait, Noah, can you stop sharing and then have Natalie share? Just because I'm wondering,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, what does the social distance mean in this study?
Yeah, no problem. Let me go ahead and pull this up. So can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
So here's kind of, this is where they kind of talk about that right here. So this is an example of what they were actually provided.
Can you just make it a little larger?
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Province, boundary, modified submarine.
So it is somewhat
Okay.
abstract, but
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
yeah, so it was fascinating to see kind of how that was being played out in those terms, because I also was curious as I was reading through the study. I felt like this image in particular was really helpful. So then based on that general information, they saw that did play overall a factor between the groups. So the test group overall was shown to use that information, and that determined how they decided to give. So no, I don't know if we want to go back to the slides to do the.
Yeah.
So the test group only was given the information about social distance.
Yes. The
And the other one
baseline
wasn't.
group was only given the general concept of here's your currency, you're split into two groups, make a determination on how you'll share that. And then the other group was given these demographic details to see and either closely or not closely identify with these other groups. And as noted here, so the social distance played a factor. If they were far from both, again, that made it less likely that they would share between groups. And it was shown that the vulnerability was probably the leading factor there. If they were far from the in-group but close to the out-group, it actually showed that they may somewhat vulnerable, or it could just do with interaction in general, that they may be more willing to give. Either because of the threat that they may face with retaliation from the out group, or just simply because they may actually identify more closely with the out group than the in group. So overall, they kind of use that to, imply that your perception of, intergroup wise may actually play a factor in kind of intergroup conflict and how you make decisions based off of your distance to people and your interaction with people. And so they're hoping that they may contribute more to the research in terms of farther social distance, that because a lot of studies have shown kind of what happens when you have multiple groups in a closer space, especially in regions or international conflicts, and kind of evaluating where there's different people groups. But this is kind of looking at what happens whenever you distance those people farther, and how does that play into the identity factors. So let's see. Yeah, so I think I went over most of those details, but does anyone have any other questions on that?
So did they measure anything with regard to like conflict, like feelings of distrust or feelings of animosity or anything like that? Or was it
Not particularly, no. They mostly focused the data on just basically how they gave. And then kind of what's been done after that is more their, I guess actually just kind of the implications behind that study. So there wasn't a lot actually on their feelings about anything. It was mostly just seeing how the distance particularly played that factor and how it impacted what happened. And then they use those contextual details to kind of make their assumptions of what this could mean.
Yeah, it seems like what was the title of the study?
Yeah, it was Social Distance and Parochial Altruism, an experimental study. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Which in this case, too, the parochial altruism is identified as the individual sacrifice to benefit the in-group and harm an out-group. And so that's sort of what they found mostly when they were distant from both groups, is that distance played a factor, and that's where you saw that the most.
So when they were far away from the groups, they gave more to their in-group, you know, potentially because they felt vulnerable and they wanted more of a connection. They wanted to make sure that they were still connected in some way. Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
So,
Yeah,
and they
and then,
have in the actual article too, if anyone's curious, they do kind of show the numbers and you know, just the compilation of the data and some charts to give a more visual representation of how that operated and how that worked.
no, that makes sense. I mean, it's interesting findings, especially with that kind of like experimental method. I haven't seen that before. So it's actually very abstract because you don't know how large the distance is. I mean, it seems like a large distance because you've got these little dots.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's almost like it doesn't quite fit into the normal sort of social distance that we think of right now, which is like 6 feet. You know, talking more about like really how distant someone is.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think if anything, this just gives more really should just further studies, I think, on this kind of concept and looking more detailed. I think it'd be really interesting to see a study like that in real time or taking people within an actual area. But
yeah, and how much would they give to their? I gotta think like just intuitively, it seems like if I were, you know, if my social identity were salient, and I could clearly define my in group from an out group, and I was put into some room, and I was like isolated against from everyone, you know, and my in group's over there, and some out group members are, you know, scattered around. I feel like I would give more to my in group intuitively to feel like psychologically like, oh, I still want to be connected to them in some way. I want to feel support in some way.
yeah, no, and I feel the same way. I think it's kind of it makes sense. It's somewhat of a natural, I think, instinct that we have to kind of hold on to what we can.
Yeah.
I wonder, what isolation, and maybe like how that might correlate with like quarantine and political spending, like how that might be. You know, you're like,
Yeah,
well,
actually, that's a really good point. Like, are people
I don't
giving
know.
more to their political party now that they're more isolated?
Right? Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Along the same lines, I was thinking about charitable giving in disasters, you know,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
rest of the world giving here and vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah, especially like in disasters where kind of it isolates people or they're not able to get in touch with other people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the implications here are really fascinating.